In the early hours of a quiet December morning in Schertz, Texas, a community that prided itself on routine and familiarity was unknowingly stepping into a story that would remain unresolved for years. This was not a place accustomed to mystery or violence. Schertz was known for its suburban calm, its predictable streets, and the sense that serious crime belonged somewhere else. That belief would be challenged by the disappearance of a young man whose absence would leave more questions than. That void represented a voluntary disappearance, an accident, or something far more serious. In cases like this, context becomes critical. Understanding who Henry Gutierrez Jr. was, how he lived, and what his life looked like in the days leading up to his disappearance is not just background information, it is the foundation of the investigation. Every routine matters, every deviation matters. Because when physical evidence is scarce, behavior becomes the map. This opening chapter is not about conclusions. It is about establishing the conditions under which a disappearance becomes possible, and why, in a place like Schertz, Texas, such an event reverberates long after the initial shock fades. The silence that followed Henry's disappearance was not empty. It was heavy, and it demanded answers that, even now, remain elusive. To understand how the disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr. unfolded, it is necessary to step back and examine the environment in which it occurred, not just geographically, but socially and procedurally. Schertz, Texas, in 2015, was a growing suburban city positioned between San Antonio and smaller surrounding communities. It was a place shaped by predictability. People noticed unfamiliar cars, neighbors recognized patterns. Routine was not only common, it was expected. This context matters because disappearances in such environments behave differently than those in large metropolitan areas. In major cities, anonymity can absorb absence. In suburban settings, absence disrupts the pattern. Someone not showing up where they are expected to be does not blend into the background, it stands out. In the days leading up to Henry's disappearance, there were no confirmed reports of instability or overt conflict that would immediately suggest danger. According to available information, Henry's life appeared structured around familiar routines. That structure is critical because investigators rely heavily on routine to establish a last known timeline. When a routine breaks without explanation, it becomes the first tangible indicator that something is wrong. At some point, Henry failed to maintain expected contact. Calls went unanswered, messages were not returned. This is often the moment when concern shifts from casual to serious. In missing person cases, the transition from unreachable to missing is rarely instantaneous. It occurs through comparison, comparing what is happening now to what normally happens. In Henry's case, that comparison raised alarms. Family members and those close to him faced an immediate dilemma common to many disappearances: how long to wait before escalating concern. Acting too quickly can feel premature, waiting too long can feel dangerous. This psychological hesitation is not a failure, it is a human response to uncertainty. But time, in missing person investigations, is rarely neutral. It either preserves opportunity or erodes it. When the decision was made to involve authorities, the case entered a new phase, one governed by procedure rather than intuition. Law enforcement must determine whether a disappearance is voluntary, accidental, or suspicious. This determination is not philosophical, it dictates resources, urgency, and investigative direction. In Henry's case, the absence of immediate evidence complicated that assessment. There were no signs of forced entry, no abandoned vehicle clearly linked to a crime, no witnesses reporting an altercation. What existed instead was silence, and silence is notoriously difficult to interpret. It can indicate safety or danger with equal plausibility. Investigators began by reconstructing Henry's last confirmed movements. This process is methodical and often frustrating. It relies on digital traces, witness recollections, and transactional records, phone usage, location data, and interpersonal contact. Each data point must be verified, timed, and contextualized. Errors at this stage can redirect an entire investigation. As the early inquiry progressed, a critical challenge emerged: the narrowing window of certainty. With each passing hour, the reliability of memory diminished. People struggled to recall exact times, details blurred. What had seemed insignificant days earlier now carried weight. but clarity was already slipping. This early phase of the case set the tone for everything that followed. The investigation was not defined by a dramatic discovery, but by absence of evidence, of confirmation, of resolution. From this point forward, every lead would exist in tension with what could not be proven. And once a case enters that territory, it becomes increasingly difficult to pull it back into focus. This is where many disappearances begin to drift, not because investigators stop caring, but because the structure needed to support certainty never fully materializes. For Henry Gutierrez Jr., this moment marked the transition from concern to uncertainty, and from uncertainty to a case that would resist easy answers. As investigators worked to establish a reliable timeline, attention turned to the last confirmed moments when Henry Gutierrez Jr. was known to be present and accounted for. In missing person cases, the concept of last known carries immense weight. It represents the final point where certainty still exists, a fixed reference before the story dissolves into speculation. Everything after that moment must be inferred, reconstructed, or cautiously hypothesized. Determining this point is rarely straightforward. It depends on corroboration, someone seeing the individual, a verified phone interaction, a digital record that can be timestamped with confidence. In Henry's case, assembling this information required interviews with family members, friends, and anyone who might have had contact with him during that critical window. Each account added a fragment to the picture, but fragments do not always align neatly. Human memory, especially when under stress, is unreliable in subtle but important ways. People remember emotions more clearly than sequences. They recall impressions rather than timestamps. Investigators must therefore translate subjective recollections into objective data, a process that introduces uncertainty at every step. A conversation remembered as late evening could mean 8 p.m. or midnight. A quick stop could last minutes or an hour. These distinctions matter. Digital evidence can provide structure, but it is not always complete. Phones can be turned off. Locations can be imprecise. Data may be overwritten or inaccessible. When gaps appear in digital records, they do not automatically imply wrongdoing, but they do create spaces where interpretation becomes necessary. In Henry's case, those gaps complicated efforts to draw a clean line between known activity and unknown outcome. As the timeline narrowed, investigators had to confront a difficult question: did Henry intend to disappear, or did something interrupt his plans unexpectedly? Voluntary disappearance is always considered early, not because it is assumed, but because it must be ruled out. Patterns matter here: financial activity, preparation, expressed intentions, and behavioral consistency. A planned departure leaves traces. An abrupt disruption often does not. Available information did not clearly support the idea of preparation. There was no confirmed evidence of Henry arranging to leave permanently or cutting ties. At the same time, there was no definitive proof of coercion or harm. This ambiguity placed the case in a gray zone that challenges investigative momentum. Without a clear narrative, resources are harder to justify, and urgency becomes difficult to maintain. As days passed, the investigation entered a phase where effort and uncertainty grew in parallel. Leads were evaluated, dismissed, or left unresolved. Each potential sighting or tip required verification, often leading nowhere. This process is slow by design, but emotionally taxing for those waiting for answers. Every phone call carries hope, every dead end reinforces frustration. What became increasingly clear was that Henry's disappearance did not fit neatly into established categories. It lacked the markers of a clear crime, yet also lacked the indicators of a voluntary exit. This in-between status is where many cases stall, not because they are unsolvable, but because they resist classification. By the end of this phase, investigators had outlined what they knew with reasonable confidence and, just as importantly, what they did not. The case now rested on absence rather than action, and on inference rather than proof. From this point forward, progress would depend not on discovery, but on patience, persistence, and the possibility that new information might emerge long after the initial search had quieted. This shift marked a critical turning point. The disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr. was no longer a developing incident. It was becoming a question, one that would linger, unanswered, within both the investigative system and the community that first noticed something was wrong. As the investigation moved beyond the initial scramble for answers, it entered a phase that is often less visible to the public but critically important to understanding how a disappearance evolves over time. This is the stage where law enforcement must decide not only what to pursue, but how aggressively to pursue it, based on the information available. In the case of Henry Gutierrez Jr., that decision-making process was shaped by limitations as much as by evidence. One of the first challenges investigators faced was the absence of a clearly defined crime scene. Without a location that could be secured, processed, and revisited, the investigation lacked a physical anchor. Crime scenes provide structure. They offer measurable data, fingerprints, DNA, signs of struggle, patterns of movement. In Henry's case, there was no such starting point. Instead, the investigation had to operate in reverse, working backward from absence rather than forward from impact. This absence placed increased emphasis on interviews. Family members, friends, co-workers, and acquaintances were asked to recount interactions, habits, and recent changes in behavior. These conversations are not interrogations, they are exercises in reconstruction. Investigators look for consistency, contradiction, and deviation from baseline behavior. Even small details, the change in tone, a missed obligation, an unusual decision, can become significant when physical evidence is lacking. However, interviews also introduce complexity. People interpret events differently, especially when revisiting them under emotional strain. What one person recalls as ordinary, another might later reinterpret as suspicious. Investigators must navigate these shifting perceptions carefully, separating genuine insight from hindsight bias. In prolonged cases, memories do not remain static. They evolve as people search for meaning in what they did not understand at the time. During this period, the role of documentation becomes central. Phone records, financial transactions, employment records, and any form of digital footprint are examined for anomalies. Investigators look for patterns of continuity or disruption. Was Henry using his phone as usual? Were there unexplained financial movements? Did he miss work or obligations without explanation? Each data point is evaluated not in isolation, but as part of a broader behavioral profile. In Henry's case, the available records did not immediately suggest a clear trajectory. There was no obvious signal pointing toward a planned departure, nor was there a definitive indication of foul play. This ambiguity forced investigators into a conservative posture. Without strong indicators, certain investigative tools and resources are harder to justify. This is not a matter of indifference, it is a function of procedural thresholds that govern how cases are prioritized. At the same time, the passage of time began to exert pressure. Leads grow colder not because they lose relevance, but because the conditions that make them verifiable degrade. Surveillance footage is overwritten. Witnesses move or forget. Physical environments change. Every day that passes without new information subtly reshapes the landscape of what can be known. For the family, this period is often the most difficult. The initial shock has faded, replaced by sustained uncertainty. There is no event to respond to, no conclusion to process. Instead, there is waiting, punctuated by brief moments of hope when a lead surfaces, followed by disappointment when it dissolves. This emotional rhythm runs parallel to the investigation, often unseen but deeply influential. By this stage, the case of Henry Gutierrez Jr. had settled into an uneasy equilibrium. It was active, but constrained, known, but unresolved. The investigation continued, but without the momentum that comes from discovery. What remained was a commitment to persistence, and the understanding that in cases like this, progress often arrives not through effort alone, but through time, chance, or the decision of someone else to finally speak. This phase did not bring answers, but it defined the framework within which all future developments would occur. From here on, the case would depend less on what investigators could find on their own, and more on whether something new, something previously unseen or unspoken, would eventually come to light. As weeks turned into months, the disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr. began to take on a different character, one shaped not by active discovery, but by endurance. This is the phase of a missing person case that rarely receives sustained attention. Yet it often determines whether a case quietly fades or remains alive within the investigative system. For Henry's case, this period was defined by repetition, restraint, and the slow erosion of certainty. Law enforcement continued to revisit existing information, not because it promised immediate breakthroughs, but because consistency matters. Reports were reread, timelines were re-examined. Investigators looked again at what had already been collected, searching for details that might have been overlooked when the case was still new. This process is not glamorous, but it is essential. Many cases are not solved by new evidence, but by seeing old evidence differently. During this time, the question of public awareness became increasingly relevant. Media coverage plays a complex role in disappearances. On one hand, exposure can generate tips and keep a case visible. On the other, inconsistent or limited coverage can contribute to public fatigue. In Henry's case, attention was present but not sustained at a national level. The story existed, but it did not dominate headlines. As a result, awareness remained largely regional, dependent on local memory rather than widespread attention. This relative quiet creates both risk and opportunity. Without constant scrutiny, cases can lose momentum. Resources shift elsewhere. Investigators are assigned new priorities. Yet the absence of media pressure can also allow for more measured work, free from speculation or external narratives that distort facts. In Henry's case, this balance leaned toward caution, an approach that preserved accuracy but limited reach. For the family, the passage of time introduced a new kind of burden. The early urgency of search efforts had passed, replaced by a prolonged state of waiting without resolution. This waiting is not passive. It involves continuous emotional recalibration, learning how to function while carrying unanswered questions. Families often become their own advocates during this stage, pushing for updates, requesting continued attention, and ensuring that the name of the missing person does not disappear from institutional memory. Investigators must also manage expectations carefully. They cannot promise outcomes they cannot control. Instead, they emphasize process, what has been done, what continues to be done, and what conditions might lead to renewed progress. This communication is delicate. Too much optimism can feel misleading. Too little can feel like abandonment. In unresolved cases, maintaining trust is as important as maintaining evidence. Another challenge that emerges during this phase is the gradual normalization of absence. Communities adapt, daily life resumes. What was once shocking becomes part of the background. This is not indifference. It is a human response to uncertainty that lacks closure. Yet this normalization is precisely what families fear most, the idea that silence might be mistaken for resolution. From an investigative standpoint, this period reinforces the importance of documentation and continuity. Even when a case appears static, maintaining accurate records ensures that future investigators, sometimes years later, can understand what was done and why. Cold cases are often revived not because of new technology alone, but because someone takes the time to re-engage with preserved information. By the end of this stage, the disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr. had fully transitioned into what is often described as a long-term missing person case. Not closed, not resolved, simply unfinished. And while the pace of visible activity may have slowed, the case remained open, waiting for the convergence of circumstance, information, or decision that could transform uncertainty into clarity. This chapter of the story is not marked by events, but by endurance. It is where the question of what happened to Henry persisted without answer, sustained by those who refused to let time alone define the outcome. As the case entered its longer, quieter phase, investigators were forced to confront one of the most difficult realities in missing person investigations: the gradual shift from active pursuit to sustained maintenance. This transition does not mean the case is abandoned. It means that the nature of the work changes. Instead of daily developments, the investigation becomes a process of monitoring, reevaluating, and remaining prepared for the moment when new information might surface. One of the central challenges during this stage is the management of incomplete narratives. Humans naturally seek coherent stories, beginnings, causes, outcomes, but unresolved cases resist that structure. In Henry Gutierrez Jr.'s disappearance, there was no single event that could be identified as the turning point. no argument confirmed as significant, no location definitively tied to wrongdoing. This lack of narrative clarity forced investigators to keep multiple possibilities open simultaneously, even when none could be confirmed. Maintaining multiple hypotheses is mentally and procedurally demanding. Each potential explanation, voluntary disappearance, accidental harm, third-party involvement, requires different assumptions and investigative approaches. Pursuing one too aggressively risks neglecting another. Yet pursuing all equally can dilute focus. Investigators must therefore make careful judgments about where to concentrate effort, based not on certainty, but on probability and available evidence. This is also the stage where institutional memory becomes critical. Personnel changes are inevitable. Detectives retire, transfer, or take on new assignments. Without thorough documentation, the reasoning behind earlier decisions can be lost. In Henry's case, preserving investigative logic, not just raw data, was essential. Why certain leads were deprioritized, why others remained open. These explanations matter when a case is revisited years later. Technological considerations also begin to evolve during this period. Advances in data analysis, digital forensics, and information sharing platforms can transform old material into new opportunities. However, technology alone does not solve cases. It only amplifies what already exists. If the foundational data is limited, even the most advanced tools have constraints. For Henry's case, the question was not whether technology would help, but whether there was enough preserved information for it to act upon. The role of tips and public input remains important, but it changes over time. Early tips are often abundant and inconsistent. Later tips are fewer, but sometimes more deliberate. Individuals who were reluctant to speak initially may reconsider as time passes, circumstances change. Relationships dissolve, loyalties shift. What once felt risky to disclose may later feel necessary. Investigators understand this dynamic, which is why cases like Henry's are never truly closed. For the family, this extended phase requires a different kind of strength. Hope does not disappear, but it transforms. It becomes quieter, more measured. Families learn to live with ambiguity while still holding space for the possibility of answers. This coexistence of acceptance and expectation is emotionally complex, and it shapes how families interact with law enforcement and the public over time. From a broader perspective, cases like this highlight the limits of visibility. Not all disappearances receive equal attention. Some become emblematic. Others remain largely unknown outside their immediate communities, yet the absence of widespread recognition does not diminish the significance of the loss. For those affected, the disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr. was not an abstract mystery, it was a permanent disruption of normal life. By this point in the narrative, the case is no longer defined by what happened on a specific day, but by what has not happened since. No confirmation, no closure, no definitive explanation. What remains is a framework, carefully maintained, patiently preserved, waiting for the moment when uncertainty gives way to understanding. This stage of the case underscores a difficult truth. Some investigations are not resolved through action alone. They persist through attention, memory, and readiness. And in that persistence, the story of Henry Gutierrez Jr. continues, unresolved but not forgotten, suspended between what is known and what may still come to light. As years pass in unresolved cases, a subtle but important shift occurs, not just in the investigation, but in how the case exists within the wider system of justice and memory. The disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr. entered this phase quietly, without a formal announcement or defining event. There was no moment when the case was declared cold. Instead, it cooled gradually, as time extended the distance between the present and the last confirmed facts. In this stage, the distinction between an active case and a cold case becomes largely administrative. Files remain open, names remain in databases. But day-to-day investigative activity slows. This slowdown is not a judgment on the value of the case. It is a reflection of finite resources and competing priorities. New crimes demand immediate attention. Ongoing cases generate fresh evidence. Older cases, especially those without recent leads, wait in the background, yet waiting does not mean stagnation. Investigators trained in long-term cases understand that time can alter the investigative landscape in unpredictable ways. People who once withheld information may later choose to speak. Witnesses who were uncertain may gain clarity. Technological improvements may allow older data to be reanalyzed. These possibilities are why unresolved cases are preserved rather than closed. For Henry's case, the passage of time introduced both obstacles and opportunities. On one hand, physical evidence, if it ever existed, became harder to recover, memories faded, context shifted. On the other hand, emotional and social pressures changed, silence becomes harder to maintain indefinitely. The weight of knowing something and not sharing it can increase rather than diminish over time. This period also reframes the role of the family. Initially, families are participants in an active search. Later, they become custodians of memory. They keep the story alive when institutional momentum slows. They ensure that the name of the missing person continues to circulate, even if only quietly. This role is not chosen, but it is often assumed out of necessity. Public perception changes as well. New audiences encounter the case without the immediacy that once defined it. For them, the disappearance exists as a narrative rather than a current event. This can be both a challenge and an opportunity. While urgency may be diminished, distance can allow for more measured engagement, free from early speculation or emotional overload. At this stage, the ethical responsibility of storytelling becomes especially important. Retelling an unresolved case requires restraint. It demands accuracy without dramatization and curiosity without exploitation. The goal is not to provoke reaction, but to preserve understanding. In the case of Henry Gutierrez Jr., careful narration serves not as entertainment, but as documentation, a way of maintaining visibility without distorting reality. Investigatively, this phase emphasizes preparedness. Files must be organized. Leads must be clearly marked as resolved, unresolved, or pending. Decisions made years earlier must be explainable to someone encountering the case for the first time. A single phone call, email, or piece of information can suddenly reactivate years of work, but only if that work has been preserved coherently. The disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr., at this point, existed in a state of suspension. Not forgotten, but not resolved. Not inactive, but not advancing. It occupied a space that many cold cases inhabit, defined less by what is happening and more by what remains possible. This phase challenges assumptions about time and justice. It reminds us that resolution is not always linear, and that silence does not necessarily mean conclusion. Some cases wait, not because they are unsolvable, but because the conditions for solving them have not yet arrived. And in that waiting, the story continues, quietly persistent, resisting erasure. When a disappearance extends beyond the immediate investigative window, it begins to interact with a different set of forces, not procedural ones, but human ones. Time changes how people relate to uncertainty. It reshapes priorities, alters memories, and redefines what feels possible. In the case of Henry Gutierrez Jr., this long passage of time did not bring answers, but it did transform the emotional and psychological landscape surrounding the case. For those closest to Henry, the absence did not resolve into acceptance in any simple way. Instead, it settled into daily life as a constant undercurrent. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went, ordinary milestones continued without him. Each of these moments reinforced the reality that life was moving forward, even as a fundamental question remained unanswered. This coexistence of motion and stagnation is one of the most difficult aspects of unresolved disappearances. From an investigative standpoint, time introduces a paradox. On one hand, it weakens evidence. On the other, it can strengthen truth. As years pass, the urgency that once demanded silence may fade. Relationships change, fear diminishes. People who once believed they had reasons to stay quiet may reconsider. In some cases, the distance provided by time allows individuals to speak more freely than they ever could in the immediate aftermath. This dynamic is one reason why cold cases are never truly dormant. Even when there are no active leads, investigators remain aware that the case exists in a broader human environment. Information does not always emerge because it is discovered. Sometimes it emerges because someone decides, at last, to share it. That decision can come years later, prompted by reflection rather than pressure. The role of public memory also becomes more complex during this phase. Without sustained coverage, cases like Henry's risk becoming footnotes rather than narratives. Yet renewed attention, when handled responsibly, can reintroduce a case to audiences capable of engaging with it more thoughtfully. Distance can reduce emotional volatility, allowing for careful consideration rather than immediate reaction. This is where long-form storytelling plays a constructive role. When a case is presented with restraint and accuracy, it invites listeners not to judge, but to observe. It allows them to understand the sequence of events, the gaps, and the unresolved elements without being pushed toward speculation. In doing so, it preserves the integrity of the case while keeping it present in collective awareness. Another aspect that emerges over time is the question of identity. Who was Henry Gutierrez Jr. beyond the circumstances of his disappearance? Long-term cases risk reducing individuals to the moment they vanished, stripping away the fullness of their lives. Ethical narration resists this tendency. It acknowledges the disappearance without allowing it to eclipse the person entirely. For investigators, this phase demands patience without complacency. Files must remain accessible. Systems must allow for re-entry. The case must be ready to receive new information at any moment, even if that moment arrives unexpectedly. This readiness is not passive, it is an ongoing commitment to possibility. As the years continued, the disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr. remained unresolved, but not inert. It existed within a network of memory, documentation, and potential. The absence itself became a form of presence, a reminder that not all stories conclude when attention fades. This stage of the case underscores a broader truth about unresolved disappearances. They do not end, they evolve. They shift shape, and they persist, not as static mysteries, but as open questions that continue to move through time, waiting for the conditions that might finally allow them to be answered. By the time a case reaches this point, its significance begins to extend beyond the individual circumstances that first defined it. The disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr. is no longer only about the unanswered question of where he went or what happened to him. It becomes a reflection of how systems respond to uncertainty, how communities absorb unresolved loss, and how time reshapes the pursuit of truth. One of the most difficult realities in cases like this is the absence of a clear endpoint. There is no definitive moment that signals completion. Instead, the case exists in a prolonged state of openness, where answers may still emerge, but no longer on a predictable schedule. This challenges both investigators and families to recalibrate their expectations. The search does not end, but it changes form. From a procedural perspective, long-term cases rely heavily on continuity. Records must be preserved accurately. Decisions made early on must be traceable and understandable years later. This continuity ensures that if new information surfaces, it can be integrated effectively rather than lost in confusion. In Henry's case, the integrity of documentation becomes as important as the evidence itself, because it preserves the logic of the investigation over time. There is also the question of accountability. In unresolved disappearances, accountability does not always mean assigning blame. Often, it means ensuring that the case remains visible within the system, that it is not quietly archived without justification. This requires deliberate effort. Cold cases survive not because they are dramatic, but because someone makes the conscious choice to keep them accessible. For the public, engagement with a case at this stage is different from initial reactions. There is less shock, but potentially more reflection. Listeners and observers are invited to consider the complexities rather than search for simple explanations. This shift in engagement can be valuable. It encourages critical thinking and patience, qualities that are often absent in early, emotionally charged coverage. The ethical responsibility of narration becomes even more pronounced here. Presenting an unresolved case requires resisting the temptation to provide closure where none exists. It means acknowledging uncertainty as a legitimate outcome rather than a failure. In Henry Gutierrez Jr.'s case, this approach honors the truth of the situation, that some questions remain unanswered not because they are unimportant, but because the path to their answers has not yet been revealed. Another dimension that emerges over time is the potential for reevaluation. New investigators, unburdened by the assumptions of earlier stages, may see the case differently. Fresh perspectives can challenge long-held interpretations and reopen avenues that were previously dismissed. This process is not a criticism of earlier efforts. It is a natural evolution as context and tools change. For the family, the long-term nature of the case requires resilience that extends beyond hope alone. It involves learning how to live with ambiguity without surrendering the desire for truth. This balance is difficult and deeply personal. It shapes how families engage with law enforcement, media, and the public. Their persistence is often the quiet force that sustains a case long after attention fades. At this stage, the disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr. stands as both a specific mystery and a broader reminder. It illustrates the limits of certainty and the importance of continued vigilance. It shows how unresolved cases challenge the notion that time alone brings answers, while also leaving space for the possibility that time may still reveal something unexpected. As the narrative approaches its conclusion, the case remains open, not in a procedural sense alone, but in a moral one. It invites continued attention, careful thought, and respect for the unknown. The story has not ended. It has simply moved into a chapter defined not by action, but by waiting, and by the enduring commitment to remember, to question, and to remain ready for the moment when uncertainty may finally give way to clarity. As the narrative draws closer to its end, it becomes necessary to confront a reality that is often uncomfortable, but essential to acknowledge in unresolved cases. Some investigations do not fail because of negligence or lack of effort, but because the circumstances surrounding them resist resolution. The disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr. exists within this difficult space, where persistence has not yet produced certainty, and where the absence of answers does not equate to the absence of truth. In examining the full arc of this case, one pattern becomes clear: the investigation was shaped as much by what could not be established as by what could. There was no definitive timeline beyond the last confirmed point of contact. No physical evidence that could anchor speculation to fact. No witnesses whose testimony could decisively alter the course of events. Each of these missing elements constrained the investigative process, not by limiting effort, but by limiting direction. This reality raises important questions about how justice systems are structured to handle ambiguity. Investigations are designed to respond to events, crimes, scenes, suspects, actions. Disappearances challenge that structure by presenting an outcome without a clear cause. In Henry's case, the system was required to operate without the very markers that typically guide investigative momentum. This does not reflect a lack of will, but a limitation of method. Over time, the case becomes a reference point, not only for those directly involved, but for investigators who encounter similar situations later. Patterns observed here inform future responses elsewhere. Decisions about documentation, communication, and case preservation are shaped by experiences like this one. In that sense, even unresolved cases contribute to institutional learning. There is also a broader societal dimension to consider. Disappearances test our collective tolerance for uncertainty. They reveal how quickly attention shifts when answers do not arrive. They expose the tension between the desire for closure and the responsibility to remain truthful when closure is not available. In narrating Henry Gutierrez Jr.'s case, it is important to resist simplifying that tension. The absence of resolution is not a narrative flaw, it is the reality being documented. For listeners, this stage of the story invites reflection rather than reaction. It asks not what do we think happened, but what does it mean that we do not know. This distinction matters. Speculation can satisfy curiosity, but reflection preserves integrity. By holding space for uncertainty, the narrative respects both the facts and the people affected by them. The passage of time also reframes responsibility. While investigators and institutions play critical roles, unresolved cases ultimately depend on the broader environment for progress. A single decision, to speak, to share, to revisit, can alter years of stagnation. That possibility remains present, even if unrealized. It is why cases like Henry's are kept open, documented, and accessible. As this chapter closes, the story of Henry Gutierrez Jr. stands not as a conclusion, but as a reminder. A reminder that justice is not always immediate, that truth does not always reveal itself on demand, and that patience is not the same as acceptance. The unanswered questions remain, not as failures of effort, but as invitations to memory, to vigilance, and to the continued pursuit of understanding. This is not the end of the case, it is the end of this telling, and sometimes, the most honest way to conclude a story is not with certainty, but with the acknowledgement that the search for truth continues, quietly and persistently, beyond the frame of narration. In the final moments of this account, it is important to return to the central purpose of telling a story like this, not to resolve it artificially, but to preserve it accurately. The disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr., as documented and understood, remains an open question. That openness is not a weakness of the narrative. It is its most honest element. Unresolved cases challenge the way we think about justice and time. They force us to confront the fact that not every story reaches a conclusion within the boundaries we expect. Some remain suspended, carried forward by records, memory, and the quiet determination of those who refuse to let absence become erasure. In Henry's case, the lack of resolution does not diminish the significance of what happened, it underscores it. There is a tendency, especially in long-term cases, to measure value by outcome. Did the case lead to an arrest? Was there a confession? Was there closure? But this framework overlooks an essential truth. The pursuit of truth has value even when it does not immediately succeed. Maintaining an open case, preserving accurate documentation, and resisting speculation are all forms of accountability. They ensure that the possibility of resolution remains alive. For the family, this persistence matters deeply. It affirms that Henry is not just a name in a file, but a person whose absence is recognized and whose story has not been dismissed. The act of remembering, of continuing to ask what happened, becomes a form of respect. It signals that time alone does not decide what deserves attention. For investigators and institutions, cases like this reinforce the importance of integrity over narrative convenience. It is easier to close a file than to keep it open without answers. It is easier to speculate than to admit uncertainty. Choosing restraint, accuracy, and patience reflects a commitment not only to solving cases, but to doing so responsibly. For those encountering this story as listeners, the responsibility is different but no less meaningful. It involves engaging with the facts as they are presented, acknowledging the limits of what is known, and resisting the urge to fill gaps with assumption. Thoughtful attention keeps a case visible, without distorting it. As this narration concludes, the disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr. remains unresolved. The questions remain unanswered, but the story has not ended. It continues in the preserved records, in the memories of those who knew him, and in the possibility that one day, new information may emerge. Until that moment arrives, the case stands as a reminder of why unresolved stories still deserve to be told, not because they offer closure, but because they demand honesty. And, sometimes, the most responsible conclusion is not an answer, but the commitment to keep asking the question, carefully and without forgetting. As we reach the true end of this narration, it is important to pause, not to conclude, but to reflect on what it means to carry an unresolved story forward. The disappearance of Henry Gutierrez Jr. does not offer resolution, justice, or certainty. What it offers instead is a record, carefully preserved, deliberately restrained, and intentionally incomplete, and in that incompleteness lies its significance. Cases like this exist in a space that is uncomfortable for both investigators and the public. They resist closure. They do not conform to the structure of cause and consequence that we instinctively seek. Instead, they remain open-ended, defined as much by what is absent as by what is known. This discomfort often leads to silence, but silence is not neutral. Silence allows memory to fade, and fading memory is one of the greatest threats to unresolved cases. By revisiting this story with care rather than speculation, the goal is not to reignite suspicion or provoke conclusions, but to preserve accuracy. Every detail that is known has been presented deliberately. Every uncertainty has been left intact. This approach respects the reality of the case, not as a mystery to be solved for entertainment, but as a human absence that continues to matter. The passage of time does not resolve questions on its own, but it does change the conditions under which answers may emerge. People change, circumstances shift. What once felt impossible to say may later feel necessary. This is why unresolved cases remain open, not out of optimism alone, but out of recognition that truth is not bound by immediate timelines. For those who knew Henry Gutierrez Jr., this story is not a narrative. It is lived experience. It is the ongoing presence of unanswered questions woven into daily life. For them, time does not diminish relevance, it deepens it. And for those encountering this case from the outside, the responsibility is to engage with it thoughtfully, without assumption, without distortion, and without forgetting. This final chapter is not an ending in the traditional sense, it is a pause. A moment of stillness where the facts stand as they are, and the unanswered questions remain visible rather than hidden. In acknowledging what we do not know, we leave space for what may yet be revealed. Until that moment arrives, the case of Henry Gutierrez Jr. remains open, not just in official records, but in collective awareness. And sometimes, the most meaningful act is not solving a story prematurely, but ensuring that it continues to be told with honesty, restraint,